Yeah, I did not expect this whole conversation to go there, but I'm gonna put a lot more thought into that.
But to be honest, I kind of did expect it to go here because that's kind of what young people are.
Young people in tech and meaning beyond tech.
Yeah.
Meaning beyond social media.
Our entire lives are inundated with technology. It's something that I wanted to bring up that I thought was interesting that I just discovered. It's kind of worrisome depending on who you are, but the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, are buying a ton of ad space on Twitter, on Facebook, to advertise Mormonism. And it's almost scary to me because, I feel like there are probably Mormons that truly do believe in Jesus Christ, but a lot of that ideology is troublesome and can cause a lot of issues. And the fact that they are putting advertisements right in front of young people, and all it takes is you to click in that, and it takes you right to, here's our mission, here's everything. And they're paying, I think it's like millions and millions of dollars to get front page advertisements on Twitter and all these places. It's kind of worrisome because the Christian church, especially the body of the church body, is mostly small community churches that wouldn't be able to afford things like that. There's no really big over-guiding organization like Mormonism where all the money flows up to there, and we can't buy advertisements that go global on Twitter. We just can't. Kiss Church can't afford that. And that's kind of scary, which is good that then it comes back to the role of the churches in the community, and being able to reach out to those men and women who might be looking for something like that.
And it's kind of like a catch-22, because one of the ways I've thought about that is you reach people online because that's where a lot of people are. So that's clearly why the advertisement works in that space. But then, like I was saying earlier, I've been doing a lot of reading and thought about trauma and the effects of trauma on people from young age or whatever. And one of the main consistent thoughts they always talk about related to overcoming any kind of trauma, PTSD, whatever it is that relationships are at the key to going forward. And so I think back to our, when we talked about that in this conversation, I just think people they want deep and meaningful and substantial, healthy, which it's not easy, because it has to be love beyond, yourself. It has to be for the good of the other. It has to be all those kinds of things. And so I think, the Christian gospel, the idea is always meet people where they're at, but then help take folks to ultimately a relationship with God, who is in God's self, the Trinity relationship,
I'm thinking about in Luke, the 99 and the 1, right? Where it's going to be hard sometimes to, what does progress look like in the church? It's going to be one by one. It's going to be individual. Something I've really noticed whenever I talk about faith with friends or people I interact with, whenever I'm open about who I am, and I say I was a porn addict, I did have sex addiction, that's something that while it can be shocking to somebody when they hear that, it at least puts me vulnerable to them, that they feel comfortable with me. They're okay, I can share things with them too. And that's the type of authenticity, back to the authenticity that people need, especially younger people. We got to keep it real with people.
Right.
Maybe
they're seeking the authenticity because a phrase, exactly what you said, the phrase I use all the time is vulnerability leads to intimacy. It's if you want intimate relationships, whether that be with somebody you want to marry, or whether that be just within your friends or with your kids or whatever, you want intimate relationships, vulnerability leads to intimacy. And so I think that all ties together well, and the idea of the church being more authentic and more vulnerable can then lead to more relational intimacy, which is what ultimately heaven is intended to be like, and what we all deeply crave. I have a couple more questions I'd like to get to, but Fern, do you have any comments on what we've said so far that you want to... Anything else you want to say?
No, go ahead and
Okay,
ask your question.
I'll ask my questions. If you could start a church from scratch for the younger generation, and I know a lot of places do this, and I have a whole philosophy of why I think church is like a family, and it's important for it has to have a dynamic that has one arm around older people, one arm around younger people, and I think it's helpful to have all the generations. But just hypothetically, for the fun of this conversation, if you could start a church that was specifically targeted at just young people, what kinds of things do you think would be particularly beneficial for that kind of deal?
I mean, I would say it really goes back to the authenticity thing. I mean, it sounds kind of repetitive, I guess, in this podcast, but I mean, a lot of people, like, we've talked about it before, how younger folks are more spiritual but not religious. They're just looking for something to give them
meaning,
purpose, meaning, self-identity, because it also ties back into the technology piece of this, because, like, we're losing our self-identity and purpose because we're so lost in the social media world. I really do think that is the biggest issue. Is, you know, you always hear like about people who are always comparing themselves to other people online because we only see the good in that photo of, you know, the way somebody looks. You know, it's just challenging, especially as women. I think that is definitely challenging.
That's interesting to bounce off that last thought there. Diversity of leadership, where, you know, traditionally, you know, people interpret the Bible however they want. You know, it's like men have to be the leaders, men have to do this. The troublesome aspect of the men outpacing women in the church is that women are declining. And why is that? It's we talked about church hurt and the issues there. A lot of women have really fantastic ideas and are wonderful, and sometimes a lot of women in the church don't feel listened to. They don't feel respected. They feel like, you know, the elders, they'll take care of it. You know, they don't want my opinion. You know,
I don't have a voice. I don't have a
right, and that's troubling in itself. That women are feeling like they're out of place in the church, and that's how do you. Something great about Kish is, like, there is a ton of diversity in leadership. You look at, you know, children's ministry, you look at worship, you look at you look all around Kish. There's women serving in all areas, but some churches aren't like that, and that's
going back to the outdated part. I would say is that you do have. I'm not saying Kish Valley's not like this, but there are churches that are like what you were describing, Hayden, where. That's one example, women not being feeling or being heard.
Right.
I also wanted to say something else.
Yeah, please.
I just thought of it, so I don't want to forget. But
it's great.
I think people who do become curious about Christianity, especially younger people like us, the first thing that they do is they open up their Bible to Genesis and they start reading from the beginning. And I know that you always say to start in the Gospels, which I agree with, but at the same time, I think people just, you know, you start a book at the first page. So they do that, and then they like we talked about in the last podcast where I said I think some people might perceive God as mean when they're reading the Old Testament. And that's the first things that they're reading, you know.
Here, are you?
Yeah, go for it.
I just want to say something, then I want to go back to what you're saying, but it relates so specifically that I just read this week that as America becomes more and more post-Christian, which is happening, I think it's on the church to really, really change and understand how to preach and teach to people who don't really know anything about the Bible. And that's something that I think I'm half decent at, but even the fact that I think that I'm half decent at means I'm probably not very good at that at all, because I don't really realize how big of a challenge that can be for folks who come to a church, or like you said, have no experience whatsoever. They open up this thing and they don't know what in the world is going on. And then if they come to the space on Sunday or whatever, there's an expectation of all this background information that they're aware of, and they just really don't. And it's not their fault. And I think as a leader, and I just think the American church is going to have to really, really think through how do we communicate almost on like multiple different levels so that people who have no clue what's happening can still get on board, you know, as well as people that maybe have some more experience with the Bible and that kind of thing too. It's just, and one of my giant faults in life of many is that I'm just a complex thinker, and so I like the idea of sharing like some complex, interesting truth from the Bible, but then sometimes you miss like the most obvious, simple things in the way you're kind of talking about.
I wanted to say something else.
Yeah, go.
Another thing that I struggled with for a long time, just like I would go to church, and this church service, we might be talking about Jonah, but then the next church service we're talking about Matthew, and then my timeline's all messed up.
Oh, right. Like what's actually happening when?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good.
As a new Christian or somebody who's maybe thinking about Christianity or thinking about following Jesus, however you want to say it, they go to church and they hear one sermon about something that happened in the Old Testament, and then you hear another sermon talk about the New Testament, and they're like, when was Jesus here?
Yeah.
Like, what books? When did Jesus say that? And when was it something that, I don't know. It got confusing for me for a lot of the time. I was very confused on timeline of things. Yeah. Because I want to hear the story in chronological order.
That's good, Fern. God bless you. I'm just so glad you're here for this, because I feel like that's both those things really go hand in hand as far as like just coming to people with the concept that they might not know as much as we, and to overly assume what they're familiar with it does a disservice to them and to the gospel both.
For the longest time, I never knew that when Jesus died on the cross, there was 2 other people that died with him. I had no idea that, and then I heard something about it, and I was like, I said to Brody, I was like, did you know that? And he's like, yeah, everybody knows that. I'm like, I feel like kind of dumb now, because I had no idea, and I thought it was cool, but apparently everybody knew that.
Right. One of the things I've thought about for here, and there are places that are doing this kind of thing. There's a thing called the Alpha course, where a lot of churches throughout the world, it started in England, are using this Alpha course, and it is kind of like an introduction for people who are exploring spiritually, that kind of tries to get at those basics, but is purposely geared only to people who are like newish to the idea of Christian faith. And I keep talking about and thinking about, and I'm not sure how or what that looks like, if it's Alpha or some other mechanism around Kish, to almost do something that's not, just the Sunday morning, that's an experience that people could go through that would kind of help that on-ramp to be a little bit less treacherous, as far as confusing and just like what's going on and where, and a place to ask questions. Because another thing, Tim Keller, who I talk about a lot, for a long time, he started a church plant in New York City, and it was a lot of new people were coming to faith, secular, high-achieving Manhattan folks, and after every church service, he would do Q&A, and he would just be like, all right, the sermon's done, whatever, just fire away. If it's about this or about anything else, just ask questions. And it kind of gave a space, and it was like known as a place for that kind of thing to happen. Obviously, we're, in a certain sense, trying to do some of that stuff with this podcast, because the idea is other people might give us your questions, or God bless you, Fern, because you always have this kind of question too, both of you. But so, yeah, I'm thinking about those kinds of things. I'm glad you brought that up. It's really helpful.
That is, Fern, you blew my mind a little bit. I'm thinking about, so whenever I started my new job previously, it was easy for me to talk about Jesus with this one kid named Ali. Give a shout out to Ali.
Ali?
Who's, really, really, believe it or not, diving into his Bible a lot, which is fantastic.
Sweet.
But then there was this other coworker of mine, basically one day was just like, yeah, I know you're religious and whatnot, but I don't know anything about Jesus and all that. And I thought to myself, I was like, you're like a white American male. How do you not know about Jesus?
Right.
And then like it's kind of like, that decline of Christianity, we're going to start seeing that pretty significantly in the now. Yeah. Where there are going to be kids that have no idea who Jesus is. And they're people that you would typically think, small town white America, that you would know who Jesus is. And that's fascinating to me. So how do you tackle that?
It's a double-edged sword in a way, though, because it's like, I think some people have had a very unhealthy previous understanding of information or of Jesus, Fern, maybe, the God of the Old Testament is angry, or Jesus is a pushover, or just like unhealthy ideas or mental images or whatever. So it's like when people have nothing, they at least don't have they don't have an unhealthy view of it. But to both of your points, like it's something that we need to work on, is like, how do we initially share? And I think of something like The Chosen or just the Bible Project, some things that are out there nowadays that are trying to kind of fill that void and really intentionally think about how Jesus is presented in some spaces that people can find and be helped.
I'm just thinking about how privileged the church has been for years and years and years.
Right.
That it was just like, oh, we wake up on Sunday, we go to church, you know who Jesus is.
Right.
The church has been so privileged with that because it was just generation after generation and generation.
Yeah.
And now we're starting to see that impact of the decline, that people have no idea who Jesus is. And that's super, it's sad, but it's also fascinating that it gives a new challenge for us as the church to kind of reshape what the church is.
We can kind of start it over.
Right, and also I think I do get really excited about this, is sometimes there's parts of what might be considered historical Christendom where like the church, to put it crudely, gets in bed with power and can't exhibit the kind of life that Jesus wants the church to exhibit, of a laying down of itself for the good of others. And so, you know, when you lose the cultural power, obviously you miss out on some things because, like you're saying, exactly, people aren't aware. But then you also, exactly the opportunity you're both saying is that if you don't have power, then you have to share from a place of humility and hopefully authenticity. You know, it's kind of like, I almost picture like all the problems you're describing at the beginning have to be solved by the church. It's just whether you get on that train sooner or later, you know, because as at least if current trends continue, you know, the church is going to have to operate a little bit more on the fringes than in the center of cultural power.
Which, honestly, I'm just thinking, it takes it back to day one.
Yeah,
where it takes it back to where Jesus was.
Yeah.
Which, praise God that he's giving us this opportunity to be on the fringes again and to reach those people that are outside of the church walls.
Right.
Like that, it feels like I'm like getting shivers thinking about it. It's like, it's a real opportunity that God's putting us in front of us to reach out to people that are out there on the fringe. Man.
One of the things I think about the early church that I get so excited about is that they were on the forefront back then of helping with, let's say, adoption. It was like people knew, like, oh, I don't want this kid. Take it to some Christian's doorstep. They'll probably raise it. And it's like, that's what Christians can be known for. Or, for instance, Christians who are going around like crazy trying to have to be moral in the sexual realm while they were still completely loving to a giant hot mess of a Roman culture that they were first in, who were doing, you know, all sorts of stuff crazier than a lot of people who think, you know, everything's crazy in America today or whatever. And so I just think it's a really, I don't know, in those moments, the way you're feeling about the shivers, I feel optimistic or hopeful or whatever about what the church could look like. Right. And I think one of the things we're going to need are more and more young people like y'all, because I'm still in this like middle ground, which is, you know, sort of 1 foot in that past, 1 foot in the future. Y'all, and then obviously our kids and on down are going to be more fully immersed in, you know, the challenges of tech, the, you know, whatever, but also all the hope of people that want meaning and want more to life than just, hey, I have a super easy experience and technology does everything for me. I can sit around, you know, whatever. Mm-hmm. There's two other questions that I didn't get at exactly, which is, I think there's an assumption that younger folks want to cool, hip, trendy churches. Is that correct in your opinion? Like, what is that like? I'm picturing, again, back to like the Instagram or whatever. It's like, you know, this cool, hip pastor and, you know, super emotional music, like that kind of thing. I'm not personally sold that that's like deeply life transforming, I guess is the best way to say it. And then the second question is, what sort of questions do younger folks have that the church can help with? I think we've probably tangentially touched on a lot of that stuff. Yeah. And I think a bunch of other podcast topics get at a lot of that. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, my hope is that there are people listening to this podcast who, you know, maybe my friends, maybe your friends who are maybe curious about Jesus, maybe they're just listening because they know us and they like us, that they feel comfortable enough to see the questions that we're asking and ask those real questions that they're looking for. Yeah. Because I just think that a lot of younger people who know nothing about Christianity, who know nothing about the Bible, they, like we just talked about, think that if they do want to dive into this, that they're going to be judged because they don't know as much as we do.
Yeah.
That's a real compassionate heart in that question, friend. It's
good. Very good, very authentic. I think, that's so true.
Because I used to show up at church and have no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would read the Old Testament and see that men had multiple wives, and see that there was like slavery, like all these things that are supposed to be bad, and I was just like, I don't know. It's hard. Like we talked about it before, but it is hard to reconcile with those things, especially whenever, like I said, people just open up their Bible and start reading from the beginning, and it's just it's a big challenge, I think.
Well, and even to the point about the Bible, where I think the Bible is so. I oftentimes try to say a phrase like, the Bible is more authentic to real human experience than most humans, whether they're in the church or not. You know, like the Bible ain't hypocritical about nothing, because it's like, I mean, there's all sorts of messy stuff happening within the church, within religious people. There's all of the folks we think of as heroes of the faith. You know, I think there's like 2 or 3 Old Testament characters that don't have some kind of significant flaw about them. I think all of that, again, part of it goes back to what we said about Christendom and just kind of this image that we can teach our kids about Christianity that's like Bible characters equals good, you are a terrible sinner. And it's like, that's not the message of the Bible at all. Like the Bible is like, we're all a hot mess. There's crazy stories in there that are more authentic than most of us are. And if you want to see how God loves messy people, then read your Bible, you know, because it's in there.
Yeah, we talked, but you have to get in the mindset of the time, the time period when things are happening. Yeah, because I didn't. Yeah, you know,
that's a game changer, because it's like whenever you think of Christians being, you know, not for child sacrifice, people think, well, you know, Abraham got close to sacrificing Isaac. Well, it's like, that's very different than every single culture around there that was sacrificing kids like crazy, you know? And God did not have Abraham sacrifice Isaac, and there's no child sacrifice that God promotes. And that's exactly right, Fern, that so much, to go way deeper into that question than we even wanted to, Tom Holland, I think I might have mentioned him before, he's a super interesting British guy. He says that most of our in the West, our cultural aspirations to treat people well and to have respect for human life and human dignity and to want to promote the welfare of all, like that actually is all downstream of the growth of Christianity in the early days. And so there's lots and lots of people now promoting certain things, and they're saying, well, shouldn't everybody be treated equally? Like, they're doing that on the basis of the Christian gospel, but then they're anti the Christian. Like, I don't know. It's just so interesting to me to think through.
I think, similar to what you said, Fern, was like people that are listening. I need them to know, like, us 3 here, we're a mess.
Yeah,
if you opened our books, it would look just as dirty, just as rancid. It's like all the dark thoughts we've had. Imagine like all of your thoughts ever put in, like that's what God's dealing with.
I oftentimes think if the whole life of all of the websites that I was on was like scrolled in front of the church on the screen, like, you know, and I'm not saying that I'm like super, you know, significantly addicted to anything or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, all of us, if we think about everything of our life being shared publicly with everybody else, would be embarrassed by it. Like, that's just
and without lack of context too. Think about it like that. Like you were just saying about the Old Testament not having that context. If people were just looking at our books without context, they would think like, oh, why was Luke on that site? Oh, well, maybe Luke was researching something. But they might be looking at it from that angle, which dives into then the importance of authentic relationship. And really, it's like, Luke, why were you on that website? That's where those types of deeper connections begin, because then Luke can then dive into why he was actually there and the reasoning and maybe it was I'm addicted to something and I need to talk about it. It's just a genuine question to ask.
The still related to that, so often nowadays I find myself trying to fixate on not judging people all in a vacuum, but thinking about people based on the context within which they lived and were raised. And I think a phrase I've been using, I texted the same phrase to somebody twice this morning, is like, God is more concerned about our trajectory than kind of like the current level that we're at. And so there's a lot of people who come from really, really disastrous messes, and that's hard. Like, that stinks, and it's very, very difficult. And I think for those people to be on a trajectory that gets them out of that, like, that's just so awesome. Even if that trajectory says, you've worked through some things, but there's still a lot of things in front of you. Like, I cheer you on if you're on that trajectory. It's the people who say, I'm flatlined, I'm good, you're bad, I'm good, I'm at whatever level out of a 10, that's good enough for me. Like, I think that's where God gets worried. That's where I get worried. And so I think, again, back to like how much people are familiar with the Bible or the gospel or Christianity, like, if folks want to grow, God wants to meet you where you're at and help you. That's a simple way to think about that.